Welcome to Mr. Bone Channel. Today's episode, true scary winter stories from Appalachia. In these mountains, winter is dark, cold, and full of secrets. Real stories, real chills. Turn down the lights and let's begin. True scary winter stories from Appalachia. The Appalachian Mountains stretch like an ancient spine down the eastern United States, from Maine to Georgia, encompassing some of the oldest peaks on Earth. But it's in the heart of Appalachia, through West Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, and the Western Carolinas, where the mountains hold their deepest secrets. When winter descends upon these hollows and ridges, when snow blankets the dark forests and ice claims the creeks, the mountains become something else entirely. They become a place where the veil between worlds grows thin, where old things stir, and where the unwary can disappear without a trace. These are the true stories, passed down through generations, told in hushed voices around with stoves and fireplaces, shared among those who know that the mountains demand respect, especially in winter. These are accounts from hunters who've seen things in the snow-laden woods, from families isolated in remote cabins during blizzards, from travelers who took wrong turns on mountain roads and encountered the inexplicable. Winter in Appalachia is not like winter elsewhere. The cold here is different, deeper, more primordial. It settles into your bones in ways that have nothing to do with temperature. The isolation becomes absolute when snow closes the roads and fog fills the valleys like milk poured into a bowl. In these moments, you're truly alone with whatever else might be out there in the dark and the cold. Part 1. The Watcher in the Woods Carter's Hollow, West Virginia. December 1978, Thomas Brennan had hunted these woods since he was 12 years old, learning the trails from his father and grandfather before him. At 43, he knew every ridge and hollow within 10 miles of his family's cabin in Carter's Hollow. He knew where the deer bedded down, where the bears denayed, where the creeks ran fastest even in the deepest freeze. He thought he knew everything there was to know about these mountains. The first snow came early that year, in mid-November, and by December the forest was transformed into a white wilderness. Thomas headed out alone on a Tuesday morning, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the air smelled like more snow was coming. He'd told his wife Betty he'd be back by dark. Same as always. He carried his Winchester 30-30, a thermos of coffee, and enough experience to survive anything these woods would throw at him. Or so he thought. He'd been tracking a buck for about 3 hours, moving quietly through the deep snow, when he first got the feeling he was being watched. Any experienced hunter knows the sensation, the prickling at the back of your neck, the instinctive awareness that you're no longer the predator, but potentially the prey. Thomas stopped, slowly scanning the surrounding forest. The snow muffled everything, creating that peculiar winter silence that's somehow louder than noise. Nothing, just the endless white trunks of birch and beech trees, the dark evergreens heavy with snow, and his own tracks leading back the way he'd come. He shook it off and continued. The buck's tracks were fresh, the snow in them not yet crusted over. He was close. An hour later, the feeling returned, stronger now. Thomas stopped again, this time turning completely around. His heart hammered in his chest in a way that had nothing to do with the exertion of moving through deep snow. Something was wrong. The forest was too quiet. No birds, no squirrels, nothing. In all his years hunting, he'd learned that when the woods went silent, there was a reason. That's when he saw them, his own tracks in the snow. But that was impossible. He'd been moving in a straight line, following the deer trail. He hadn't circled back. Yet there they were, his distinctive boot prints, crisp and clear in the fresh snow, coming from a direction he hadn't traveled. Thomas felt the first real touch of fear. He was an experienced woodsman, not prone to getting lost or disoriented. He pulled out his compass. The needle spun lazily, refusing to settle on any direction. He tapped it, shook it. Nothing. The needle just kept rotating, as if north had ceased to exist. The snow began falling again, thick flakes that quickly obscured visibility. Thomas made a decision. He'd follow his own tracks back to where he'd started this morning. Easy enough, except when he turned around. He realized he could no longer tell which tracks were the ones he'd made coming in and which were these mysterious duplicates. They overlapped, diverged, circled back on themselves in patterns that made no sense. He chose a direction and started walking, fighting down the panic rising in his chest. He'd walked maybe 20 yards when he saw something that stopped him cold. There, pressed into the snow beside his boot print, was another track. It was roughly the size and shape of a human footprint, but wrong in ways that made his stomach clench. The toes were too long, the heel too narrow, and there were only 4 toes instead of 5. Whatever had made it was walking upright. Pacing him step for step, Thomas raised his rifle, scanning the trees. The snow fell harder now, cutting visibility to maybe 30 feet. In the growing whiteout, the trees seemed to shift and move, their dark trunks appearing and disappearing in the swirling snow. That's when he heard it, a sound that would haunt him for the rest of his life. It started as a low sound, almost below the range of hearing, a thrumming that seemed to come from the earth itself. Then it rose, becoming a call that was neither animal nor human, but something in between. It echoed through the hollow, bouncing off the ridges, seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Thomas ran. He crashed through the snow, abandoning all pretense of woodcraft, caring only about putting distance between himself and whatever had made that sound. Branches whipped his face. His rifle banged against his side. His breath came in ragged gasps. Behind him, he could hear something moving through the forest, keeping pace with him effortlessly. He risked a glance over his shoulder and saw a dark shape flowing between the trees, too tall to be a bear, moving too fluidly to be human. He ran for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. His legs burned, his lungs screamed, but the primal terror kept him moving. Then, miraculously, he broke through a wall of rhododendron and found himself on a familiar logging road. His truck was parked there, exactly where he'd left it that morning. He didn't question the luck, didn't stop to think about how he'd found his way out. He simply threw himself into the cab, started the engine, and drove. He didn't tell Betty everything that night. He said he'd gotten turned around in the snow, had a bit of a scare, decided to call it a day. But he never went back to those woods. The buck could keep his rack, and whatever else was out there could keep its territory. It was 3 days later when Thomas heard the story from his neighbor, old Jim Watts. A body had been found in Carter's Hollow, about a mile from where Thomas had been hunting. The man had been missing since the previous winter, a hiker from Ohio who'd gone into the woods and never come back. They'd found him sitting against a tree, perfectly preserved by the cold, his face locked in an expression of absolute terror. There wasn't a mark on him. The coroner said it was exposure, but Jim said something else, something he'd heard from the deputy who was first on scene. The man's footprints led the tree where he was found, but there were other prints around him, circling that tree dozens of times. Prints that looked almost human, but not quite, and the man's compass was clutched in his frozen hand, the needle spinning uselessly, pointing nowhere at all. Thomas sold his cabin the following spring. He told Betty he was getting too old for the mountain winters, that it was time to move closer to town. But sometimes on cold winter nights, he'd wake up from dreams of endless snow and that terrible sound echoing through the hollow. And he'd remember the feeling of being hunted, of being prey in woods he'd thought he owned. He never hunted again. The cabin on Raven's Ridge, Margaret Sullivan's grandmother had warned her about the cabin on Raven's Ridge. "Don't ever go up there in winter," the old woman had said, her gnarled fingers gripping Margaret's hand with surprising strength. "That place has a hunger to it. Always has." But that was just mountain superstition, Margaret told herself. She was a modern woman, a school teacher from Asheville with a master's degree and a sensible Subaru. When she inherited her grandmother's property in the mountains of North Carolina, including the old hunting cabin on Raven's Ridge, she saw an opportunity, a winter writing retreat, a chance to finish her novel, A Little Adventure. She arrived on a Friday in January, when the forecast called for clear skies and cold temperatures. The cabin was accessible by a steep dirt road that switchbacked up the mountain. It was rustic but maintained, with a wood stove, a propane refrigerator, and kerosene lamps. No electricity, no cell service, just her and her laptop and the winter woods. Perfect. The first 2 days were exactly what she'd hoped for. She rode in the mornings, took walks in the afternoons, and spent the evenings reading by lamplight. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional call of crow or the wind in the bare branches. At night, The stars were so bright they seemed close enough to touch. On the third night, everything changed. Margaret was awakened by a sound outside the cabin. At first, she thought it was a wind, but then it came again, a rhythmic thumping, like someone beating on the side of the cabin with an open palm. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding. The thumping moved along the wall, from the bedroom toward the main room. Thump, thump, thump. Methodical, deliberate, purposeful. She grabbed her flashlight and walked to the window, her breath fogging in the cold air. The cabin had grown frigid, as if the wood stove had been out for hours, though she'd stoked it before bed. She shined the light out the window, illuminating the snow-covered ground outside. Nothing. No footprints. No tracks of any kind. The snow was pristine, undisturbed. The thumping stopped. Margaret stood at the window for a long time, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and snow. Eventually, the cold drove her back to bed, where she lay awake until dawn, listening. She told herself it was animals, a bear or a deer, something perfectly explainable, but she'd seen the unmarked snow. Whatever had made that sound had left no trace. The next day, Margaret decided to leave. The writing could wait. Her grandmother's warnings suddenly didn't seem so superstitious after all. But when she went out to her Subaru, she found all 4 tires flat. Not punctured, not damaged. Simply flat, as if all the air had been let out simultaneously. She had a spare, of course, but only one. She went back inside to get her phone, thinking she'd hike down to where she could get a signal and call for help. That's when she realized her phone was gone. She'd left it on the kitchen table. She was sure of it. Now it was nowhere to be found. Margaret searched the cabin methodically, trying to keep the panic at bay. No phone. And now that she thought about it, she couldn't find her car keys either, or her wallet. All the things she'd need to leave, to get help, simply gone. As the winter sun began its early descent, Margaret faced the truth. She was trapped. The cabin was miles from the nearest neighbor, up a road that was barely passable in good weather. In winter, with no vehicle, she might as well have been on the moon. She built up the fire in the wood stove, more for comfort than warmth, and tried to think rationally. She had food for several more days. She had water from the pump. She could survive until someone came looking for her, which would be when? She'd told her friend Sarah she'd be gone for a week, maybe 2. It had been 4 days. Night fell like a hammer. The thumping started again at 8 p.m., according to her watch. This time it was louder, more insistent. It circled the cabin, moving from wall to wall, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Margaret sat at the kitchen table, her back to the stove, trying not to imagine what could be making that sound. Then the scratching began. Long, slow drags like fingernails on wood, but deeper, stronger. Something was scratching at the door, at the windows, at the very walls. The sounds overlapped, creating a horrible cacophony that seemed designed to drive her mad. Margaret grabbed the poker from beside the wood stove. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was something. She approached the front door, her hand shaking. The scratching continued, patient and persistent. Through the small window in the door, she could see nothing but darkness and falling snow. When had it started snowing? "Who's there?" she called out, her voice cracking. "I have a gun." The lie seemed to give her courage, even though she'd never held a gun in her life. The scratching stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the noise had been. Margaret stood at the door, poker raised, waiting. Then she heard it, a voice, muffled by the door and wind, but definitely a voice. It was saying something, the same words over and over. She pressed her ear to the door, tried to make it out. "Let me in, so cold. Please let me in." It was a woman's voice, weak and desperate. Someone was out there, freezing, dying in the snow. Margaret's hand went to the door latch. Every human instinct screamed at her to help, to save this person from the cold. But she remembered her grandmother's words. That place has a hunger to it. "Who are you?" Margaret called through the door. "Please, so cold, dying." The voice was fading, growing weaker. Margaret's hand trembled on the latch. What if it was real? What if someone really was dying out there, and she was letting them freeze, because of superstitious fear. "Tell me your name," she demanded. There was a pause. The wind howled. Then the voice came again, but this time it was different. It was her own voice, her exact voice, with her inflection and accent, speaking back to her through the door. "Let me in, Margaret. Let me in so I can be you." Margaret stumbled backward, nearly dropping the poker. The thing outside laughed, not with her voice now, but with a sound like wind rushing through a hollow tree. The scratching resumed, more frantic now, as if whatever was out there was angry at being denied. She retreated to the bedroom, shut the door, and pushed the dresser in front of it. Then she sat on the bed, poker in hand, and waited for dawn. The sounds continued all night, scratching, thumping, and worst of all, voices. She heard her mother calling her name, her grandmother warning her, her friend Sarah begging for help, all of them perfectly mimicked, all of them lies designed to make her open that door. She didn't open it. When dawn finally came, the sound stopped. Margaret waited another hour before moving the dresser and venturing out into the main room. Everything was as she'd left it. She went to the door and looked out the window. The snow had stopped. The morning sun was breaking through the clouds. And in the pristine snow around the cabin, there were no tracks, no footprints, no marks, nothing to indicate that anything had been there at all, except for one thing. Pressed against every window, every door, covering every possible entrance to the cabin, were handprints, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, overlapping and smeared, all pressed against the glass and wood from the outside. And they weren't human hands. The fingers were too long, the palms too narrow, and each hand had one too many fingers. Margaret found her phone and keys sitting on the front porch, along with her wallet. They'd been there all along, just outside the door, waiting for her to come out and get them. Bait in a trap. She didn't touch them. Instead, she broke a window in the bedroom, climbed out, and hiked down the mountain in the snow, leaving everything behind. It took her 6 hours to reach the main road, and her feet were frostbitten by the time a passing truck picked her up. She sold the property site unseen, never returning to Raven's Ridge. The cabin still stands there, maintained by some property management company. They rent out sometimes to people looking for a winter retreat, a little adventure, sometime alone in the mountains. Most of them stay one night. Some stay two. None of them ever stay three. And every winter, the handprints appear in the windows, waiting. Part 2. Blizzard tail snowbound in Harlan County. The blizzard hit Harlan County, Kentucky, on February 3rd, 1996, and it was a kind of storm old-timers measured all other storms against. The snow came down so thick you couldn't see your hand in front of your face, and the wind blew so hard it piled drifts 15 feet high against the sides of houses and barns. The power went out countywide within the first hour, and it would be 4 days before the roads were clear enough for help to reach the more isolated areas. The Patterson family, James, his wife Carol, and their 3 kids, lived in a farmhouse at the end of a hollow, 3 miles from the nearest neighbor. When the storm hit, they did what generations of mountain families had done before them. They brought in extra firewood, filled every container with water, and settled in to wait it out. The first day and night were almost pleasant. The kids thought it was an adventure, playing board games by lamplight and roasting hot dogs in the fireplace. James and Carol told stories and tried not to worry about the livestock in the barn or how long the food would last if the storm continued. The second day, they heard the singing. It started in the late afternoon, when the wind was at its worst. At first, they thought it was just a storm, the way wind can sound like voices when it blows through trees and around buildings. But then they heard it clearly, a woman's voice, singing an old hymn, in the sweet by and by, clear as a bell, coming from somewhere outside in the blizzard. James went to the window, peering out into the wideout. He couldn't see more than a few feet, but the singing continued steady and strong. No one could be out there, he told himself. No one could survive in that storm. Probably just the wind, he said, but he didn't sound convinced even to himself. The singing continued for about 10 minutes, then stopped as suddenly as it had started. The family looked at each other uneasily, but said nothing. What was there to say? That night, around midnight, there was a knock at the door. James was dozing in his chair by the fire when the sound jerked him awake. 3 sharp raps, clear and deliberate. Carol grabbed his arm, her eyes wide in the firelight. "Don't," she whispered. They sat frozen, listening. The knock came again. 3 raps, patient and persistent. "Help me?" The voice from outside was a woman's, weak and desperate. "Please, I'm lost. So cold." James stood up, moving toward the door. Every fiber of his being said to help, to save whoever was out there, but Carol pulled him back. "Remember the Kincaid story," she hissed. James did remember. Everyone in the county knew about the Kincaids, a family that had lived up in these mountains back in the 1950s. During a bad winter storm, they'd heard someone calling for help. They'd opened their door to help and, well, the details vary depending on who told the story, but the end was always the same. The Kincaids were never quite right after that night. The mother had gone completely mad, had to be institutionalized. The father had disappeared into the woods one day and never came back. And the children had nightmares for years about what had come when they opened that door. "Please," the voice called again. "I can hear you in there. Why won't you help me?" James's hand was on the doorknob. He couldn't explain the compulsion, the overwhelming need to open that door. It was as if his hand was moving of its own accord. "Daddy, no." His oldest daughter, Emma, grabbed his other arm. There's something wrong with her voice. James paused. Emma was right. There was something off about the voice, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. The words were right. The tone was desperate. But there was something underneath, something cold and utterly inhuman. He took his hand off the doorknob and stepped back. The knocking came again, harder now, more insistent. Boom, boom, boom. The door shook in its frame. "You will let me in." The voice was changing, dropping lower, losing its feminine quality. "You will open this door." The family huddled together in the center of the room, as far from the door as they could get. The knocking grew more violent, the whole house seeming to shake. Then suddenly it stopped. In the silence that followed, they heard footsteps on the porch, not walking away, but circling, moving from the front door toward the side of the house. They heard those same footsteps on the walls, impossibly walking up the side of the house to the roof. Heavy treads crossed back and forth above their heads while they stood frozen, looking up at the ceiling. Then they heard the singing again, that same hymn, but this time in a voice so deep and resonant it seemed to vibrate in their chests. The voice was directly above them now, on the roof, and it sang verse after verse of "In the Sweet By and By," while the family held each other and prayed for dawn. The storm continued all the next day, but the knocking and singing didn't return. James finally worked up the courage to look outside, peering through the curtains. The snow had drifted so high it reached the windows, creating white walls around the house. They were entombed, buried alive in snow. On the 4th day, the storm finally broke. By afternoon, they heard the distant sound of snowplows on the main road. By evening, a county deputy on a snowmobile made it up their hollow to check on them. "You folks okay up here?" he asked. That was a hell of a storm. They said they were fine, just low on supplies. James didn't mention the singing or the knocking. What would he say? How would he explain? But as the deputy was leaving, he paused and looked up at the roof of the Patterson house. His face went pale. "Jim," he said quietly, "you got any idea how those got up there?" James stepped outside and looked up. There, on the roof of his house, in snow that had to be 2 feet deep, were footprints. They crisscrossed the entire roof in complex patterns, circling and overlapping. But they weren't human footprints. They were too long, too narrow, and the stride was too wide. Whatever had made them had legs far longer than any human. And there was no way for anything to have gotten up there. No ladder, no trees close enough, nothing. Just tracks that appeared on the roof and ended at the edge, as if whatever had made them had simply stepped off into the air. The deputy radioed for someone from the county to come take a look. But by the time they arrived the next day, a warm spell had melted enough of the snow to obscure the tracks. People thought James and the deputy were mistaken, that the storm had played tricks on them. But James knew what he'd seen. and he knew that something had circled his house, had walked on his roof, had tried every way it could to get inside. He didn't know what it wanted, or what would have happened if he'd opened that door. He just knew he'd never forget that voice, sweet as honey and cold as death, singing hymns in the heart of the blizzard. The Patterson family moved to Lexington the following year. When people asked why, James said he'd gotten a better job offer. But late at night, when the wind howled and the snow fell, he'd wake up thinking he heard singing. And sometimes, just for a moment, he'd feel that overwhelming compulsion again, that need to open the door and let something in. The road to Nowhere State Route 281 runs through some of the most remote parts of West Virginia, winding through mountains that have forgotten more than civilization ever knew. In winter, when snow and ice claim the road, it becomes one of the most dangerous drives in Appalachia. The locals know better than to travel it after dark when a storm is coming. But sometimes people don't have a choice. Daniel Matthews was driving 281 on a February night in 2003, trying to make it home before the worst of snow hit. He was a long-haul trucker, and he'd pushed his luck, taking one more load when he should have holed up for the night. Now he was paying for it, his pickup fighting for traction on an increasingly icy road while snow reduces visibility to almost nothing. He should have been familiar with this road. He'd driven it 100 times, but something was wrong. He'd been driving for over an hour, and he should have reached the junction with Route 19 by now. Instead, the road just kept going, winding deeper into mountains he didn't recognize. His GPS had stopped working about 20 minutes back, the screen frozen on a map that showed him nowhere near where he should be. His cell phone had no signal, which wasn't unusual in these mountains, but the radio wouldn't work either, just static on every channel, sometimes forming patterns that almost sounded like voices. Daniel was an experienced mountain driver, not prone to panic, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. The road shouldn't go this way. These mountains shouldn't be here. He'd driven this route for 15 years, and he knew it like he knew his own name, except now he didn't. He slowed down, considering turning around, when his headlights caught something in the road ahead. A figure, standing in the middle of the highway, facing his truck. Daniel's foot hit the brake, and his truck slid sideways on the ice before coming to a stop about 30 feet from the figure. It was a woman in a white dress, her long dark hair whipping in the wind. She stood perfectly still, not reacting to the truck's headlights, not moving out of the road, just standing there in the middle of a blizzard, wearing nothing but that thin white dress. Daniel's first thought was that she must be freezing, that he needed to help her. He opened his door and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, snow stinging his face, wind threatening to knock him down. "Ma'am," he called out. "Ma'am, are you okay?" The woman didn't move, didn't respond. Daniel took a step closer, then another. Something was wrong with the way she stood. Too still, too perfect, like a statue. And the way the snow fell around her, it seemed to avoid her, creating a clear space where no snow touched her or the ground beneath her feet. "Ma'am." Daniel's voice was quieter now, uncertain. The woman's head turned to face him. It moved wrong, too smoothly, rotating far more than a human head should be able to turn. In the glare of the headlights, Daniel saw her face clearly for the first time. It wasn't a face. Not really. It was a rough approximation of a face, like a child's drawing made flesh. The features were slightly off, eyes too large and too far apart, mouth too wide, nose barely there. And when that mouth opened, revealing too many teeth, Daniel heard a sound that wasn't human speech, but something that mimicked it badly, like a recording played backwards. He ran. Daniel threw himself back into his truck, slammed it into reverse, and hit the gas. The truck fishtailed wildly on the ice, but he fought for control, desperate to put distance between himself and that thing in the road. In his rearview mirror, he saw her, still standing there, perfectly still, watching him go. He drove backwards for what felt like miles, afraid to take his eyes off that figure, afraid it would appear in front of him again if he turned around. The road seemed endless, and his truck's warning lights were flashing. He was overheating the transmission, would blow the engine if he kept this up, but he didn't care. He just needed to get away. Finally, impossibly, He saw lights behind him, the lights of the main highway. He was approaching the junction with Route 19, but from the wrong direction, driving backwards down a road that shouldn't have led there. He didn't question it. He spun the wheel, letting his truck slide around, and accelerated onto 19, heading for the nearest town. He found a truck stop outside of Summersville and pulled in, his hands shaking so badly he could barely turn off the engine. The attendant found him sitting in his truck an hour later, still gripping the wheel, staring at nothing. "You okay, buddy?" the attendant asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Daniel didn't answer. How could he explain? He'd somehow gotten lost on a road he knew by heart, had driven deeper into mountains that shouldn't exist, had encountered something that wore the shape of a woman the way Daniel wore his clothes. Poorly fitted and obviously fake. He called his wife, told her he'd be late, that he'd run into bad weather. He didn't tell her about the road or the woman, or the way his GPS now showed no record of where he'd been for that lost hour. According to his truck's computer, he'd been sitting still, engine idling, for that entire time, but his odometer showed he'd driven over 60 miles. Daniel never drove Route 281 again. He took the long way around, adding hours to his route, and when people asked why, he said the road was too dangerous in winter. He wasn't lying, but the danger wasn't from ice or snow. 3 years later, Daniel heard a story from another driver, a guy who'd been passing through West Virginia one winter night. The guy had gotten lost on some mountain road, had driven for hours in circles, had seen a woman in white standing in the road. He'd stopped to help her, had opened his door, had almost gotten out his truck before something made him look at her face, really look at it, and he'd seen what Daniel had seen. The guy had run to, had somehow found his way back to civilization, but he said he still dreamed about it sometimes, dreamed that he'd stopped, gotten out, walked over to that woman. In his dreams, she turned to face him, opened her mouth too wide, and spoke his own voice, saying, "Thank you for stopping." And in his dreams, he looked down and saw that he was wearing a white dress, and his skin didn't fit quite right anymore, and he was standing in the middle of a road that led nowhere, waiting for the next traveler who might stop to help. Daniel never spoke to that driver again. But sometimes on winter nights when he was driving through mountains in the dark, he'd check his rear view mirror compulsively, afraid he'd see a figure in white standing in the road behind him, that mouth too wide, those eyes too large, watching and waiting. The road to nowhere is still there, somewhere in those mountains. It appears on no map, shows up on no GPS. But on winter nights, when snow falls thick and fog fills the valleys, sometimes drivers find it anyway. Most of them escape, like Daniel did. Most of them find their way back to roads that exist, towns with names, people who are actually people, most of them. But every year, a few cars are found abandoned on mountain roads, doors open, engines still running, no sign of the driver. The police file reports. Search parties scour the woods, and families put up missing person posters. And every year, a few more people join the watchers on a road to nowhere, wearing shapes that almost look human, standing perfectly still in the snow, waiting for someone to stop and help. The Ice Fisher's Tail Mirror Lake sits high in the mountains of eastern Tennessee, a pristine body of water fed by springs and mountain runoff. In winter, it freezes solid, the ice thick enough to walk on, thick enough to drive on if you're careful. The locals have been ice fishing Mirror Lake for as long as anyone can remember, drilling holes in the ice and sitting in small shelters, waiting for trout and bass to bite. Robert Hendricks had been ice fishing Mirror Lake every winter for 30 years. He knew that lake in all its moods, knew where the fish ran, knew how to read the ice. He'd taught his son to fish there, and his son had taught his son. The Hendricks family had a spot on the north end of the lake, away from the crowds, where the fishing was always good. On a Friday in January 2008, Robert drove up to Mirror Lake for a weekend of fishing. The weather report was good. The ice was thick, a good 14 inches, plenty safe, and he'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. He parked his truck in the lot, loaded his gear onto his sled, and headed out across the ice to his usual spot. The lake was quiet that afternoon. A few other fishermen were scattered across the ice, small figures in the distance, but Robert had the north end to himself, just the way he liked it. He drilled his holes, set up his shelter, and settled in with his thermos of coffee and his fishing rod. By late afternoon, he'd caught 3 decent-sized bass and was feeling pretty good about things. The sun was setting early, as it does in January, painting the sky pink and orange. The temperature was dropping fast. It would be well below zero by morning, but Robert was prepared with plenty of warm clothes and a good sleeping bag in his shelter. That's when he noticed the hole. About 20 feet from his shelter, there was a hole in the ice. Not a fishing hole. Those were only 6 or 8 inches across. This was big, maybe 4 feet in diameter, perfectly round, with smooth edges. The water in it was black and still, and frost was already forming around its rim. Robert frowned. He'd been on this ice for hours, and that hole definitely hadn't been there before. He would have noticed. Someone must have drilled it recently, though he couldn't imagine what for. It was way too big for fishing, and nobody had been anywhere near him all afternoon. He walked over to examine it, his footsteps crunching on the snow-dusted ice. The hole was deep. The ice here was thick, at least a foot. Whoever or whatever had made this hole had put serious effort into it. Robert knelt down, shining his flashlight into the black water, trying to see the bottom. The flashlight beam penetrated maybe. Thank you for watching. This is Mr. Bone Channel, where every story chills your spine. If you enjoyed this horror story, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. See you in the next nightmare.